In the dim corridors of medieval authority, where empires rose upon the shattered hopes of the young, one little girl would become both prisoner and queen long before she turned 13. Isabella of France, remembered by history as the she-wolf, began her reign not in glory, but with tears she was not allowed to cry. Her tale exposes the merciless gears of medieval politics, where children served as bargaining chips and marriage was simply war conducted through vows. It was 1308, and across the Channel, preparations were already in motion for a wedding that would redraw the map of two kingdoms. Yet this was no storybook romance. The bride was only 12, spoke nothing but French, and trembled at the thought of the sea crossing that would deliver her to an alien throne. Her groom, Edward II of England, was 24 and far more devoted to his male companions than to fathering children with his young wife. Isabella's wedding gown, woven from cloth of gold and crimson silk, was almost as heavy as the child herself. Chroniclers of the day recorded how the little queen had to be supported as she walked the aisle of Westminster Abbey, not from bridal nerves, but because the sheer weight of her regalia threatened to topple her. The symbolism was cruelly obvious, a girl crushed beneath emblems of power she was far too young to grasp, much less command. The ceremony dragged on for 4 full hours, every word spoken in Latin that Isabella scarcely understood. She stood mute and motionless while archbishops sanctified a marriage that would shape half a century of English history. When at last the golden crown was set upon her head, onlookers saw her slender neck bow beneath its burden, a haunting foreshadowing of the load she would carry. As London's cathedral bells pealed in celebration of their new queen, Isabella of France stepped into a gilded prison. She had been changed, in a single day, from a sheltered French princess into an English diplomatic tool. Her childhood ended the moment that crown settled on her hair, a crown she had never sought. The coronation feast would be her final taste of innocence. Seated high beside a husband who hardly glanced at her, surrounded by courtiers whose language she was still mastering, Isabella began to feel the loneliness that would shadow her entire queenship. She was no longer truly a child, yet not yet a woman, trapped in the cruel in-between of royal girlhood. That wedding night, mercifully brief, according to the records, marked the start of Isabella's brutal schooling in the realities of medieval marriage. At 12 she was expected to bear England heirs while swimming in the lethal tides of court intrigue. Her French servants were sent home, her toys boxed away, her childhood officially interred beneath yards of silk and rigid etiquette. Royal marriage in the Middle Ages was a finely tuned weapon of statecraft, every bit as deliberate and destructive as any catapult. Children like Isabella were marked from the cradle as diplomatic prizes. Their future partners were chosen for borders gained, trade routes secured, armies allied. The human price was never part of the equation. Negotiations for Isabella's hand began when she could barely toddle. French and English envoys argued for years over her dowry, the lands that would travel with her, and the exact clauses that would bind the alliance her body would seal. She was spoken of in the same breath as cattle or acreage, her own desires never entered the room. To King Philip IV, her father, Isabella's marriage was the keystone of his policy toward England. By planting a French princess on the English throne he hoped to blunt England's threat and perhaps steer its foreign course. She was his most precious bargaining counter, worth more than gold or provinces because she could give birth to future kings who carried English blood but, he hoped, French loyalties. The surviving marriage contract is a chilling monument to medieval legal coldness. It lists her dowry, regulates her household, even limits how many French servants she may keep. Most disturbing are the rules governing her body. She may not write to her family without English permission, may not leave the kingdom without the king's leave, and must submit to repeated examinations to prove her virginity remains intact until the marriage is consummated. Edward II's tastes were no secret in the French court. His intense attachments to men, above all to Piers Gaveston, were gossip from Paris to Rome. Philip knew full well he was handing his daughter to a husband who would probably ignore her, but that was judged acceptable so long as heirs eventually appeared. The 12-year age gap was normal for the time, yet it created a particularly poisonous mismatch, a battle-hardened adult king and a sheltered child princess colliding like flint and steel. As soon as the betrothal was announced, Isabella's preparation for queenship began in earnest. French tutors drilled her in English customs, English law, the bloodlines of every great English house. She learned to write her name in English letters, to recognize the faces of powerful lords, to glide through the labyrinth of court ceremony. What no one taught her was how to shield herself from the soul-crushing isolation that lay ahead. Westminster Palace, her magnificent new home, was less a residence than an opulent cage built to display royal splendor while chaining royal liberty. Her apartments, though dripping with luxury, formed a gilded prison where every hour was dictated by protocol, every movement watched by appointed keepers, every breath weighed for political meaning. Her days unfolded like clockwork. Chapel bells woke her, she prayed with her English ladies, she ate prescribed meals at fixed times, she filled her afternoons with pursuits deemed suitable for a queen. She might read, but only books her guardians approved. She might play music, but never songs that might stir too sharp memories of France. Every letter she received was opened and read before it reached her hands, every letter she sent was examined, censored, or filed away as potential proof of disloyalty. Several of her ladies-in-waiting doubled as spies for the king's council. Physical freedom was equally illusory. Guarded corridors and watched doors penned her in. She could not stroll the gardens unescorted, could not visit kitchens or stables without permission, could not leave the palace without a formal procession planned days in advance. In those early years Edward treated her with cool indifference that sometimes flashed into open cruelty. Absorbed by his devotion to Piers Gaveston, he regarded his child bride as a tiresome obligation. Weeks could pass without a direct word between them, even when they sat side by side. The damage showed. The lively, clever girl chroniclers once described grew quiet and drawn. She bit her nails until they bled, tugged at her hair during ceremonies, flinched at sudden noises. Food became both refuge and battleground, she often left lavish dishes untouched, knowing every public mouthful 1100 was judged for hidden meaning. She learned to conceal hunger the same way she concealed homesickness, starving in body and spirit while preserving the mask of royal poise. Nothing humiliated Isabella more than her husband's shameless worship of Piers Gaveston. The Gascon knight's influence turned the Queen's own court into a stage for her disgrace. Gaveston had been Edward's companion since boyhood and, upon Edward's accession, was promptly created Earl of Cornwall. Handsome, clever, and utterly unscrupulous, he flaunted his power, heaped scorn on English nobles, and treated the young Queen with calculated contempt, openly calling her the French wench, and mocking her accent. The worst moment came at the coronation banquet itself. Gaveston appeared draped in jewels meant as coronation gifts for Isabella, gifts Edward had simply handed over, including a magnificent ruby necklace made expressly for her. She was forced to sit in silence while her husband's favorite paraded her stolen treasures before the entire court. Protocol itself was weaponized. At formal gatherings Gaveston took the place of honor at the king's right, the seat that belonged to the Queen. Visiting ambassadors were told to greet Gaveston first. The sexual nature of the king's bond with his favorite, though never openly documented, was an open secret. Chroniclers speak of shared beds, intimate gifts, and embraces that shocked even a relatively permissive age. For Isabella, watching the husband who ignored her lavish on another the affection she craved was daily torture. Her French family, appalled by reports reaching Paris, tried diplomatic pressure. Philip IV fired off furious letters demanding better treatment, hinting that French military support might vanish. The intervention only worsened her plight. Edward hated being told how to behave. The Gaveston years taught Isabella unforgettable lessons in power's true face and the cold patience survival demanded. She learned to observe, to remember every insult, and to wait. The humiliations she swallowed would one day fuel her metamorphosis from broken child into the she-wolf who could topple kings. The legal machinery of medieval child marriage was elaborate and merciless. Canon law insisted on consent, but for royal children consent was assumed to be given by parents. Modern notions of informed choice were inconceivable. Consummation was a matter of state, recorded with intrusive precision. Isabella's marriage remained unconsummated until she was about 15, an agonizing 3-year limbo of repeated medical inspections to confirm her virginity. Court doctors prescribed dubious herbs and diets meant to hasten puberty, examinations that today would be recognized as institutionalized abuse. Every milestone of her reproductive life was orchestrated for maximum political advantage. Her first pregnancy was timed to favorable stars and favorable diplomacy. When conception did not come quickly, astrologers and physicians debated the most auspicious nights, treating the Queen's womb like a strategic resource. Her household was staffed not for comfort but for control. English ladies replaced French ones, loyalty to Edward, not kindness to a lonely girl, was the sole criterion. There was no language for childhood trauma, her obvious misery was dismissed as female weakness or lack of piety. At 17 Isabella finally conceived. Pregnancy turned the ornamental queen into the vital vessel of dynasty, yet the months were anything but joyful. Her diet, movements, even her emotions were regulated by doctors whose chief concern was a healthy male heir. The birth of the future Edward III in 1312 briefly raised her status, she had done her duty. But motherhood itself was tightly controlled, royal infants belonged to the state, not their mothers. She saw her son only at formal audiences. The pressure never eased. Each subsequent pregnancy was monitored like a campaign, miscarriages brought not just grief but blame. She was expected to beam with maternal pride in public while surrendering her children to the same political machine that had devoured her own childhood. After Gaveston's execution in 1312, Edward's devotion shifted to Hugh Despenser the Younger, an even more rapacious favourite. The Despenser tyranny, as chroniclers termed it, finally pushed Isabella from endurance to rebellion. Despenser did not merely want wealth, he wanted the government itself. He became the Shadow King, turning Edward into a puppet. Isabella was stripped of any remaining influence and subjected to systematic persecution. Her supporters were exiled or imprisoned, her lands were seized, she was left penniless and friendless, dependent on Despenser's whim. Her health collapsed. The once vivacious queen grew thin and haunted, washing her hands obsessively, starting at shadows. In 1325 salvation appeared disguised as diplomacy. Her brother Charles IV was on the verge of war over Gascony, Edward needed someone the French would trust. Isabella persuaded the king and Despenser that only she could avert disaster. It was the most fateful miscalculation of Edward's reign. She sailed for France in March 1325. The moment English spies were out of sight, years of tension seemed to fall away. French courtiers marveled at how quickly the hollow-eyed prisoner became once more a proud, commanding queen. Return was unthinkable. Letters to Edward grew evasive, reports grew critical, her behavior grew boldly independent. In France she met Roger Mortimer, exiled English baron, escaped prisoner, and another victim of Despenser's cruelty. Together they forged an alliance that was at once political, military, and passionately personal. For over a year they planned. Isabella raised money, hired mercenaries, and crafted a propaganda masterpiece. She was returning not as a rebellious wife but as a mother rescuing her son's kingdom from a tyrant. In September 1326 a small but determined army landed in Suffolk. Edward's regime crumbled almost without a fight, the king and Despenser fled westward. In November 1326 Hugh Despenser faced the reckoning Isabella had dreamed of for years. His trial was legal theatre, the verdict was never in doubt. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered, slowly, deliberately, while the Queen watched from a platform, her face unreadable. Edward was forced to abdicate in favour of his 14-year-old son. Isabella and Mortimer ruled as regents. For 3 glittering years the she-wolf held real power, ending ruinous wars, stabilizing finances, governing with ruthless competence. But power acquired through rebellion is fragile. In October 1330 the 18-year-old Edward III struck at Nottingham Castle. Mortimer was seized and executed. Isabella, dragged from her bed, found herself powerless before the son she had crowned. She was spared, honored, pensioned, and quietly imprisoned in comfortable retirement. For almost 30 years she lived on at Castle Rising, a relic of vanished storms. She died in 1358 at 63 and was buried in the same wedding gown she had worn as a terrified 12-year-old bride. Isabella of France remains an enigma, victim and avenger, child destroyed by politics who learned to wield politics as a weapon. Her life exposes the machinery that ground royal daughters into instruments of state, and the extraordinary lengths to which one girl, broken, cornered, and finally unleashed, would go to seize control of her own story.